Good afternoon. My name is Hank Clark, Program Director of the Political Economy Project. And on behalf of Chris Hardy, Peter Jenkinson, and our friends in the Dickey Center for International Understanding, it's a great pleasure to welcome all of you here today. You know, most scholars would love to be able to boast of having altered the conversation in a particular field of study. But our speaker today, Alan Macfarlane, has the rare distinction of having changed the direction of not one but two distinct areas of research. When his first book on witchcraft in Tudor and Stuart England, which I just happen to have right next to me, first came out in 1970, it helped to completely transform the way that we think about witchcraft as a social and a historical phenomenon. After that remarkable debut, Alan did one better a few years later when he published this book, The Origins of English Individualism, which permanently altered the way we talk about the so-called transition from feudalism to capitalism and the broader topic of modernity as a whole. In roughly 20 books overall, some based on field work in Nepal, Japan, and China, he has explored this broad theme in a truly wondrous variety of ways. Alan is a holder of PhDs in both history and anthropology, a longtime professor of social anthropology at King's College, Cambridge, before what is facetiously called his retirement in 2009. He's a fellow of the British Academy, winner of the Huxley Memorial Medal of the Royal Anthropological Institute, and it really is a privilege for us to have him with us today. Now, the format for today's event will be very simple. Alan will speak for a while, and if you have questions as he goes along, please use either the chat function or the raise hands button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I'll try and start with some student questions at first, but everyone present is welcome to participate, and we'll take as many questions as we have time for. Without further ado, Alan, thanks so much for being with us this afternoon. The floor is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Hank. It's a curious business, this virtual Zooming, particularly when you're coming up to your 80th birthday. It's a fairly new phenomenon. So I'm very grateful for your kind introduction and for your request that I give this short talk. It has to be short, of course, and I can therefore only just give you a fish, as it were. And the fishing rod, in other words, if you want to find out more about the background and go into things which I'll have to superficially skim across, then Hank has further references. Above all, I would suggest you have a look at my book, Understanding the Chinese A to Z on China, as well as my website, www.alanmacfarlane.com, which has got a lot of my materials on it, and also links to a big YouTube site and so on. So that's where the fishing rod is. I want to start with Einstein and a favorite quote of his: "Problems cannot be solved at the same level of thinking as created them." Now, that seems very wise. You have to go up another level to solve problems. And one of the biggest problems, I think, that is facing all of us now is the relationship between America and China, and more widely, the West and China, the Anglosphere, and so on. It's a conversation and attempt to understand between these civilizations, which I've been involved with now quite a lot over the last 20 years. And I would like to contribute something towards defusing and adding to understanding of these two great civilizations. And in this talk, what I'll do is to stand up above this relationship by imagining that I'm de Tocqueville coming back to study America and China. Of course, what I say will not be de Tocqueville at all. It'll be me pretending to be de Tocqueville, but I will try and approach it with that wide vision that he applied in all his work. His work particularly, I think, is helpful for understanding these two great civilizations because he had a certain methodology which is very rich for the study of civilizations, which is why I think his Democracy in America is probably the best single book on a civilization I know of. I'll briefly sketch that in a couple of 2 or 3 minutes, because it's really what makes us attracted to de Tocqueville. The first part of the methodology is the idea of the point of departure. That is, that you can understand a great deal about a civilization by going back to its beginnings, its roots. Civilizations are like trees. And if you know what the seed is, then you can then trace its subsequent history. America is seeded by England, and China is seeded by a long, long history with a particular point 2,200 years ago with the first emperor of China, unified China, the Qin emperor. And so you go back to the point of departure and then you can learn a lot. A second method is a structural approach. By that I mean structuralism in the French sense of looking at the relations of things, not looking at politics or economics or religion in itself, but the relation between things. It's not A or B, but the relations between. And that is a very fruitful way of understanding societies. It's what anthropologists do in their holistic methods. And it's particularly important with China, which is a structural civilization, which is why many of the best books on China have been written by French authors. Another method he used was the comparative approach. He said, I don't write a line about America without really thinking about France, or at least thinking about France in the back of my mind. And so you never understand a place except in relation to a comparison with other civilizations. And I think that's extremely important insight. And of course, it's the basis of anthropology, which is a comparative science. He was a historian. He knew that you can't understand the present without going back a long way in history, not just the last few decades, but deep into history. And he was interested in history. So time matters. And I've always tried to follow that as a historian. But he was also an anthropologist. That is to say, he was interested in the present and the present problems. He wanted a cross-section and a temporal section. And the cross-section he gathered in America, certainly by fieldwork. In other words, participant observation through traveling around America and talking to people who gave him many good ideas and understandings of America. And finally, he was aware that the way we progress in the arts and humanities is not through working up from the data, but working from theories down to the data and then back to the theories. The hypothetico-inductive method. And so he guessed. Some people accused him of guessing what America was like before he even went there, but he certainly guessed. And that is what I'm doing about America, because I don't know it really well enough to say much about it. But I'm guessing what it's like from what I've read, and I'm guessing what China is like from my visits there. Now, finally, the approach I'm going to take is based on a remark of Adam Smith, who said that discovery and creativity comes out of wonder and surprise, and then admiration, perhaps. This is in his essay on astronomy. And I'm going to look at these two great civilizations very briefly by looking at the wonder and surprise which Tocqueville might have felt if he went to America now or China now. So I'll start with America. In terms of wonder, he would have been just overwhelmed by the wealth and the material progress of America. He could see it sort of coming, but the Industrial Revolution hadn't occurred in America by then, and that America has created a really good material life for such a huge population and filled the world, not just America, with amazing and useful and interesting and life-enhancing things, would have given him a sense of wonder. He would have been filled with wonder that that promise of America to give a liberal, open, free sort of environment for free thought and exploration has continued. He was enormously impressed at the time, and it has in many ways continued to the present. He would have been impressed by the generosity of America, particularly after the Second World War and the Marshall Plan, and through its various donations and support of world organizations and the United Nations and so on, and the tradition of philanthropy in America, of rich people like Bill Gates and others giving away a lot of their wealth. He would have been really impressed by all of that and how it has continued. A lot of his work on America was, of course, about civil society, about associationalism, which he thought was the key to American dynamism and prosperity and what held America together. And he would continue to be impressed by the way Americans worked together on all sorts of projects and schemes and building all sorts of new ventures. So civil society and associationalism would have continued to impress him. And finally, he would have wondered, in the good sense, at the idealism of America, that it is still a very hopeful society, optimistic. Many people believe that the world can be changed and that America can help to change it for the better, and that it is a society with such dynamism that it can recover from its mistakes, as he said, and push forward. So there were many positive things about America, he would say today. But I think also he would have, from his earlier study in his predictions, have noticed certain fragilities which he would, as a friend of America, felt it his duty to point out. And some of these would surprise him. One would be that he went to the Deep South and he saw the slave society, and he was very distressed by what he saw there because it was much worse than anything he'd seen even in France. And I think he would have thought that in 150 years or so later, at least 200 years nearly, this would have healed itself, that slavery and racism would have disappeared more or less. And of course, if he was looking at America now, he would have been surprised that slavery, not formal slavery, but a sort of caste-like division of society and racism has continued pretty strongly in certain parts of America right to this day, as we are constantly seeing on our screens. He would have been, I think, deeply surprised by the violence of America. This is two kinds of violence I think he would have been surprised at. One was when he went there, he knew that the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms was ensconced in American Constitution, and that people defended themselves, that America was a frontier society. You had to protect yourself still against the British and other powers that might attack you, and against nature and wildlife and so on and so on. So the right to bear arms was important. What he would have been surprised at, of course, is that 200 years later nearly, people still thought that bearing a muzzle loader or an old musket or whatever on a small scale applied now to a huge nation with submachine guns freely available from your local store. And he would have been really, I think, really surprised, as many people in Europe are, at this gun culture, not only of private citizens, but also of the police. And he would have thought this was a sign of a weakness. But the violence which he would have been surprised at equally was external violence. He had this very interesting theory that America was free from militarization and the need for a standing army because it was an island, basically. It didn't have land neighbors who could attack it. The Canadians weren't going to attack it, the Mexicans and so on. So it was free to lead a fairly peaceful existence. And this was a theory he applied to a certain extent to Britain as well, that democracy and freedom are protected by not having landed enemies. When America stopped being an island, in other words, when aeroplanes were invented, and particularly from the Second World War, America had to defend itself. And so it moved into the military-industrial complex, where it spends vast fortunes on military hardware. And this, I think, he would have felt was extraordinary and possibly extraordinarily wasteful. America had a chance after the Second World War. It was technologically and militarily superior to any other nation. And it had a couple of generations when it led the world and could set a world pattern. And it could have devoted a good proportion of this wealth externally, if it wanted to raising living standards around the world, water, health, education, and so on. And it did do some of that. But if you set the foreign investment and help against the military expenditure, and particularly against the extraordinary destruction of parts of the world through the more or less constant wars that America has fought since the Korean War. Britain did this, of course, for many centuries, so I can't be on a high horse, but the constant destruction, both of life and also of livelihoods and people migrating, of the Vietnam and later wars and through to the Middle Eastern wars, he would have thought this violence was out of hand. Another feature he would have noticed was the materialism of America. He noticed this as a cultured Frenchman, of course, and said that the Americans seemed to be obsessed with making money and with wealth. They talked about many things, but above all, they talked about making money. And if he saw America now, he would have said this tendency has increased, if anything. The gap between the rich and the poor has grown. The equality that they were striving for has not happened in the way it might have done. And this would have saddened him. The ecological destruction across America, he predicted when he went up to the Canadian wilderness and looked at the pristine landscape and said, this, in 100 years, this will all be factories and the waters will be polluted. But the scale of the pollution, perhaps now, would have surprised him. Another thing, of course, he wrote a lot about was individualism and the atomization. Coming from a familistic and Catholic society, he was struck by the way in which everyone seemed to be alone in America. The family system was quite weak and people were competitive and individualistic. And though he both admired this for its freedom effects, he also saw it as a weakness and wondered what would keep America together. And above all, he saw it as a weakness in relation to politics, because in a famous passage in Democracy in America, he foresaw a world where people had become so individualistic and so materialistic and so inward looking that they had given up wider concerns. He painted a sort of picture of a brave new world in which you had a huge, omniscient, benevolent power which would take care of life. It would say, just leave it to me and I'll look after you. And people would say, oh, that's fine, we'll get on with our money making and our sports and our good living. You look after us. And that tendency to retreat into private interests and go out of the public sphere is something which he would have noticed as a tendency which has continued and is a considerable danger in America now. So he would have said many good things continued, and America is an extraordinary place. But some of the flaws and weaknesses which I detected have developed, and we have to be careful. Now, you know about America, most of you are Americans, so I will now spend a little longer on China, which some of you may know less about. My interest in China started when I went there in 1996, just as a tourist. And it was still sort of Maoist China to a certain extent. It was still people on bicycles and wearing blue shirts and so on and so on. You couldn't buy a bottle of wine in Beijing very easily, as I remember. And then I went back in 2002, and it was already transformed considerably. But as I've been there almost every year since 2002, 17 visits with my students who can speak Chinese, and therefore going underneath the surface and traveling all over China except the Northwest, lecturing, being a professor at various Chinese universities and so on, and working on various projects with China from Cambridge to try and build a bridge of understanding on a cultural level. And all this, my attention really devoted to China mainly in the last few years. I've got to see a China which I think if Tocqueville went there would fill him with wonder. Like America, he would be amazed by the material progress. Those of you who haven't been to China, I suggest if you have a chance, go to Shenzhen, which is, its economy is now equivalent or equal to both Hong Kong and Taiwan combined in certain measures. And it's a city of the future, but there are others, many big Chinese cities, which I've been to, obviously Shanghai and so on. They are extraordinary cities, and this is not just in the cities, in the countryside. What has happened, and it's very easy, as Tocqueville said, once a revolution is over, you forget that it happened. The fact that China has had the largest industrial revolution in history by far. It's 10 times bigger than the Japanese industrial revolution. In other words, a country which is 10 times the size, and it's done it faster even than Japan, and therefore far outstrips any other industrial revolution, and that it has managed to do this pretty peacefully, pretty orderly, without the ecological destruction which the British had in the 19th century in our country, is really a subject for wonder. This part of this, of course, is the technological progress. When I go to China, I suddenly feel, as Tocqueville must have felt when he went to America, as if I'm stepping into the future. This is the physical infrastructure, like the trains and the planes and so on, and the communications systems, but every aspect of the technology. I remember quite early on, in about 2003 or 4 in Beijing, talking to computer scientists from America and China, saying, when will China catch up with America in software and hardware? And they said, well, hardware 20, 30 years, software 50, 70 years. Well, now China in many ways is ahead of anywhere else in the world in terms of computing and supercomputing and so on and so on. So the communications technologies WeChat and all these other things are really amazing. And putting it together, the recovery from the terrible situation China was in the 19th century, right through to the end of Mao, real famines, real poverty, and to have escaped from that, obviously with help from America and the models of the West, but through hard work and intelligence. And above all, another miracle, which is often forgotten, to raise over 700 million people out of abject poverty and to give them a decent sort of life. I saw that in 1996, going to remote areas. People were saying, we can eat meat for the first time. We've got our houses properly heated. We've got some education. And this extraordinary, the biggest uplifting of a segment of population ever to occur in history, has occurred only in the last 30 odd years. A subject which is very fraught in the understanding between East and West at the moment is the treatment of ethnic minorities, and particularly in the northwest of China. And I can't speak much about that because I've never been to Xinjiang or even Gansu, but I've been around quite a bit. My favorite part of China is Yunnan, Sichuan, Guangxi, and so on, the south, the ethnic minority areas. And there the treatment and integration of the minorities, over 100 million minority people in China, is exemplary. I work a lot in India on the Naga borders and so on. And the treatment of the Chinese of their ethnic minorities is far more successful in many ways than India has achieved. And so, leaving on one side whatever we think about the Northwest, they've had a great success with ethnic minority integration. And more generally than just money, the extraordinary development of various aspects of their social world. Take, for example, education. When I first went to China, they were just improving their educational systems. 120 years ago, they didn't have universities. The first universities were founded, modern universities, the end of the 19th, early 20th century. The schooling system was very antiquated and Confucian and memory-based and so on. And Mao more or less broke the educational system. So in the last generation and a half, they've moved from almost ground zero in education to having schools which are in many ways outpacing anything in the West, particularly in mathematics and science. Universities which are really first class in many ways. There are many defects, of course, both in the schools and which we all know about, but it is an amazing achievement, and right down to free education. I've been to remote villages in Yunnan, Sichuan, where there is free universal education up to a certain level. And the same in healthcare. The hospitals have their defects and so on, but basically they've provided the barefoot doctor model of universal healthcare for China is now very widespread. And they have, we can see it dramatically when we now look at India, which has many relics of British organizations. And yet we can see the difference in the healthcare reactions in China and India to COVID. And that actually takes me on, leaving on one side things like the legal reforms in China, which are quite dramatic. I've looked at and talked to and been to courts in China, and it still has defects. For example, it's still highly political and so on and so on. But they are they've done a huge job in integrating Western civil law and criminal law into China. But turning to the healthcare, again, we forget when something great has been achieved, we immediately overlook it. And this is a very recent achievement. I have many friends in Wuhan, and when the virus struck there, some of them had just come back from Wuhan. And so I watched the terrible events of the first month or so in Wuhan. And of course, many people are critical about the secrecy and so on, which is a feature of China because you're frightened of alienating people above you or losing your job. And so you cover up. So the cover up is well documented. But after that, after a month or so, here is a population of 1.4 billion, which at the beginning didn't really know what it was facing, and without any vaccinations and so on. And it is the one big country on earth which effectively has dealt with COVID. I mean, there may be a second wave and there are little outbreaks all the time, but it is an extraordinary achievement. And looking at how it was done, it's partly, of course, because of the surveillance and the smartphones and so on. But above all, it's because of the Chinese way of thinking of the world, which is group-based. And so people sacrifice themselves for others. They worked extremely well together, as Chinese often do. And so the dealing of this in the big Chinese cities and so on was based really on the nature of the Chinese organization and social structure more than any top-down political surveillance. And so these are some of the things Tocqueville would have wondered at. In terms of surprise, he would have been surprised at the ecological destruction of China over the centuries. If he knew about the tragedy of the commons, he would know that in China, people are at a desperate level often, and they will pillage whatever is available. And so the desert, the growing of the deserts and the cutting down of the forests and the river pollution and so on. But that also is being addressed. I remember when I first went to China, I was told I was going up, or the second time I was going up to Liaoning in the northwest, which is the old Manchurian area, and I was told not to go because of the pollution. When I arrived, I found they'd moved the factories out of the cities, and they were reforesting and so on. And China has, in many ways, the most successful ecological drives that are occurring. It's, as we know, a supplier of much of the technology for alternative energy and so on. So it's a mixed bag with ecology. He would have been surprised at the degree of the surveillance in China. All the time, people are aware that they are being monitored and watched. Because of the nature of China, this is nothing new. It's been going on for 2,000 years. A huge place, the size of Eastern and Western Europe and part of Russia. The only way a very small military center could hold this place together was basically through surveillance, and particularly the Qing and before were watching all the time because there wasn't much to hold China together. It was a place where there were different languages and different cultures and different customs. And at any moment, it was like a great forest, which at any moment a spark could ignite. And in China, what that means is not just local rioting and a few thousand people. It can mean, in the worst case of all, the Taiping, it can mean up to 40 million people dying. A civil war in China, the White Lotus, or even the Boxer with a few million, is really terrible because not much holds it together, and it doesn't have a huge army and police force internally to put these down traditionally. So the Chinese have been, their nightmare is civil disobedience. And so they crack down in a way which the West finds extraordinary, though, of course, we crack down in Britain if a few students or others start causing trouble, we send in the police and round up people and so on. But in China, it's done in a really tough way because of letting things get out of hand. And this is all part of a feature of China, which to a Westerner keen on individual rights and individual freedoms and freedoms of speech and so on, can find stifling. There's a conformity and a nervousness. It's like Japan with the saying, don't be a nail that is sticking out. If you stick out, there's liable to be a hammer which will knock you back in. So people are aware. I must say that I've been amazed at the openness of China. I've lectured all over China at universities and so on, and I ask them often what they want me to lecture about, and they say, oh, well, love, and they often say democracy or civil society. These are times when I've been told, don't mention these words in China, but, I go to universities. I know there are people in the audience who, may be keeping an eye, but I've never, in all the talks and books I've published, had any real problems at all in talking openly. It's the way you approach China. If you treat it with respect and say, I'm doing this because I want China to be a better place and I understand your problems, then the Chinese are open to criticism. But if you are aggressive towards it, they don't like it. I think one thing that would really surprise Tocqueville, and one of the most difficult things for a Westerner to understand about it, is the absence of any absolutes. I realize when I'm in China that I've been brought up in a Greek Christian Western Renaissance scientific tradition, which thinks in terms of one God, one truth, everything integrated and absolute. It's a sort of, in terms of science, it's a binary world. It's an Einsteinian world. When you go to China, as I found also when I went to Nepal, it's a quantum world. It's a both and world. It's a more or less world. And you can see this in so many ways. You can see it in its philosophy, in the simplest form, in its yin-yang. Yin and yang are complementary. Yin has a bit of yang in it. It's constantly changing and turning into the other. So everything is fluid. This is something that Joseph Needham, the historian of science, pointed out as a weakness of China in relation to science. There are no principles. Everything is, it all depends, contextual. And you can see this in its quasi-religious, because of course China doesn't have religion. There is no word for religion in Chinese. It means just the rights of the ancestors or whatever. So in China, you have Taoism, you have Buddhism, you have Confucianism, and all these mixed together mean that you can be all of them at the same time. It's as if you could be a Muslim and a Christian and a Jew all together. Now, to us, this is abhorrent, but in China, you can move fluidly between belief systems, and that's really difficult for us to comprehend. Another thing that's difficult for us to comprehend is the nature of China as a political unit. We tend increasingly to think in terms of nation states, nations, imagined communities, America, England. Tocqueville would have seen early that America, and in fact, Tocqueville anticipated. He didn't use the word imagined community, but he used the words ideal community, and he used it in the sense that Benedict Anderson uses it. America is an ideal. It's a place where you feel American, even though you don't know the people at a distance. And the West is based on these imagined nations. China has never been like that. China is too big for that. It's not united by any sentiment. For 2,000 years, if you went to any part of China and you asked someone in any part who you are, they wouldn't have said Chinese. They wouldn't have even said Han. They would have said, I'm someone from this village, I'm someone from this province, maybe I'm someone from Yunnan. And although that's changing quite considerably now, it's still largely the case that China is too big. It's a civilization. It's like Europe, but bigger. And therefore, you can't really say, I am European still. And you can't really say, I am Chinese. So we have to look at its political sociology in a different way. And that also applies to the last thing I'll mention, which is its imperial nature. China is a great imperial country, top down and so on and so on. And for 2,000 years, it has been an expanding empire. The Han core has expanded outwards and outwards and outwards and outwards. But the way in which it's done that is not the way in which the European and British and American empires expanded. They expanded largely by force and by either military force or economic force. The first great European empires were based on the idea of absorbing their conquests in South America or India or elsewhere. So the Spanish and Portuguese and other empires were conquest empires which wanted to make the people they conquered into French or Portuguese or Spanish or whatever. They became part of the culture and society and politics of the center. This moved on to a different kind of empire with the British Empire, which was an economic and political empire. So economics first, make money, and then keep peace. And they had to abide by the laws and so on. Their culture's up to them. So it's a slightly muted kind of empire. You then move on to the American empire, which is even more muted. It's basically economic, trading, and so on. And to a certain extent, that is guarded by making them democratic. So it's a weaker form of the British kind of empire. Chinese empire traditionally has been too big and with too many borders to make it sensible to try and go out and conquer around. So it takes the form of what some people call a galactic empire. That's like a galaxy. So you have the sun, the middle kingdom, China, in the middle, and revolving round it, keeping their distance, not being absorbed, but not being freed, are the peripheral countries. So Vietnam, Burma, at certain times Tibet, Mongolia, Korea, Japan. These are tributary states. They are younger brothers. China is the older brother. And in the Confucian view of life, the younger brother is very deferential. He has to do what the older brother says, but he also has to be respected as a kin. So you go to Beijing periodically from Japan or Vietnam, and you take your tributes, just as they thought Lord Macartney was doing for the British, coming and bringing tributes to the emperor. And so you don't go out and conquer them militarily, but you want them to be part of your galaxy. And I think it's very important for the West to understand that, because when we're thinking about what the future of the expansion of China, the Belt and One Belt, One Road, and the movement into Africa and South America will look like, it'll look much more like that tributary kind of model, I think, whereby you have younger brothers in these countries who show you respect, and you also protect them if necessary. And so it's a political superior, inferior, but it's not an absorption. Now, I've generalized hugely here, and I'm sure some of you will say, oh, Alan, it's not that simple. And you may even disagree more fundamentally than that. But I ask your forgiveness for this very wide sweep. And as I say, if you would like to see what I say in a more muted way, then have a look at my website and some of my books. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Alan. You've given us a lot to think about. Those of you who have questions for Alan, please feel free to use either the chat function or the raise hands feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I'll start with one question that we've received already. I think of it as the Darren Acemoglu question. Darren Acemoglu is a political economist at MIT who's written a book called Why Nations Fail. And he argues that China is unlikely to be able to maintain truly sustainable growth unless it develops inclusive institutions, that is to say, political institutions that are more inclusive and that therefore ensure economic participation across the whole length and breadth of the social order. And the question is, what do you think about that? Does China need inclusive political institutions in order to maintain sustainable economic growth into the future? Do you have an opinion about that, Alan?
Well, it is one of the big questions. I mean, often some of my colleagues, like Ernest Gellner, believe that democracy only survived as long as it produced economic wealth, but that it was good at producing economic wealth. And this question is related to that. In other words, can you have a party state, centralized party system, which can do the first great leap into wealth, but can it maintain it? My view is that it can maintain it up to a certain point, but that the general populace of China is now very well educated. It knows about the world. There is no firewall that can keep out ideas from outside, and many Chinese are educated outside. And the desire for participation grows. The real problem is, how the hell are you going to do it? I mean, I've talked about this elsewhere. Democracy won't work in China. That is to say, the model of Greek democracy, the idea that a small city-state in Greece, you can participate if you're male, of course, and if you're rich and if you're a man, or even what worked in Britain with 10 million, 15 million, whereby you feel part of the governing participation by giving your votes. It's totally meaningless to feel that with 1.4 billion people, you can have a vote and have a say. So I think the way in which I hope China will develop is a model based on Adam Smith's idea that you have a night watchman state at the center, which basically takes care of the meta things, war and international relations and finance. And then you delegate all the rest of the power down and down to the level at which it's appropriate that it takes decisions. Now, this is basically how civil society works and should work. In other words, as Tocqueville said, in America and England, the real roots of democracy, he didn't mean democracy in the voting sense, he meant democracy in the civil society sense. The real roots of democracy are at the local level. He said famously, if I was a dictator in England, I wouldn't be worried by the House of Commons or anything they said. I would be worried about the local parish council deciding to mend the roads without referring it upwards. So basically, China has done a lot of this. I was amazed on one of my early visits to be taken to a village where they had secret ballot elections for the head of the village and the village council and so on. So there is increasingly a lot of local democracy. And if you go to separate counties, you'll find that the city government, the regional government, the town government, the parish government have a lot of power now. A lot of power is being pushed down. If you combine that with the growth of civil society, in other words, people joining together, and although this is a big threat, I mean, civil society, as Hobbes pointed out, is a threat to Leviathan. Associationalism and trusts are gnaw away at absolute power, and therefore the Chinese government is wary, very wary of civil society. But if you look at it more broadly, China is now filled with associationalism, but it's virtual. Many of my friends are working together on publishing projects, on educational projects, on cultural projects, on games projects, virtually through the internet. So people are working together and taking decisions about their lives, because I think the question really is, how do people feel that they are running their own lives? How are they participating in decisions that affect them? And if they feel that they are doing that, then they will put their back into economic and other growth. So I think it is possible in China, and I think it is moving in that direction, but it's not easy.
Thanks very much. Well, your last comments sort of anticipated my next question, and since there's no one on the queue, I will pose it to you. As you no doubt remember, Max Weber thought that China was not a good candidate for the development of modern capitalism because of what he called the obstacle of the SIB, the authority of the SIB. That is to say, the extended clan lineage systems that existed in China. And what you've just said is that one source of their dynamism and their perhaps even their economic growth today is a kind of virtual civil society. I wonder if you have any other thoughts about the way in which the traditional family system and kinship system in China have been adapted to succeed under modern conditions, under the conditions that you've seen in the last 20 years or so.
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. I should mention that I've been doing a very long 22-hour Zoom, which is being put up on my YouTube and so on. And one of the questions I answered was, what would Max Weber make of China? And I talk at more length about this there. Weber thought that China was conforming to Marx's idea of the Asiatic mode of production and what Montesquieu talked about. In other words, it's stuck. It's an iceberg that can't unfreeze. And this is because of its religion, because of its technologies, but as you say, because of what we now call its clan system, SIB. And that indeed was a considerable block. And this is one of the ironies. Chairman Mao, as you know, destroyed the family system of China. It was one of the olds, along with other things. And he basically dismembered the clan system. In other words, clan properties, clan houses, ancestral rituals. So basically, he did what all previous vast swathes cutting through China, the Manchu or the Mongols, he cut China down to ground level and destroyed the family system. Now, what happened and made men and women equal, which was an extraordinary achievement, what has happened in the last 40 years is that, as always happens with China, sprigs grew up because underneath the roots are terribly strong. So China is now partially Confucian again, and it's partly imperial again, and it's partly all the things that have come up. But the family system has adapted. It's now much, much more flexible. I work with a lot of young Chinese, and I get inside their lives because they tell me about things. And they are still much more familistic than you or I. If you want to see what China is like or feel what China is like in its family system, go to Italy. This is why most of my young Chinese female friends marry Italian men, not just for the cooking or the culture, but because they feel at home in the kind of extended Mediterranean, not just Italy, but Spain, the sort of familistic Southern European world where the family is much more important than in the Anglosphere. That's how China is now. In other words, most of the young Chinese I teach, when I ask them where they get their funding to come to Cambridge, from my family, my uncles, my aunts, it is still a unified economy, and you are expected to go back and pool it back into the family reserves when you go back. You listen. If your parents say, we need you here, you go there. If your family says, we don't like your boyfriend, you really listen to them. But love marriage, a separate career, separate financial system is much stronger than it could ever have been up till Chairman Mao. So they have and of course, this is also one of the strengths of China, because one of the things that people like Amartya Sen and others who talk about Chinese success in business say is that this familistic business mode is also very successful. The overseas Chinese have been very successful because they pool their resources, they work along family trust networks. And so they may be combining the best of the family, not absolutely atomistic, but much freer than it was in the time of Max Weber.
Thanks very much, Alan. One of my students weighs in with a question about China as a superpower. Is it your sense that the Chinese, either the Chinese government or the Chinese people, aspire to replace the United States as the #1 global superpower?
Well, you need to, I mean, you probably know, and I hope your student will read Graham Allison's book, Destined for War, which is about superpower rivalry, the famous Thucydides trap, and the way in which people, I think this is a fear of the West, but it's not something which I think the Chinese really think about much. Certainly until Xi Jinping, they kept absolutely quiet about this. They never said, we'll never reach America. We're never going to be like that. Now they, I think, would aspire to be strong enough to be equals. In other words, not to repeat the terrible history of the 19th and 20th centuries and be trodden down by the West. And there is a legacy of China as a middle kingdom and the superior culture of the world. So there is a lingering feeling of we are the great civilization. But the idea of becoming dominant in any political way or even military way is not of interest. In terms of economics, maybe the Chinese would expect, which they probably will, and would like to be the biggest country, not just in, as it is in already in purchasing power parity, not just in GDP, but in wealth standards, be at the moment at a middle level. It would like to be up at the wealth standards of America. And so I think the becoming a superpower is a side effect. It's not the aim. But I think the question itself reveals something I've noticed about myself and about many of my Western colleagues, which we have this confrontational model. Our whole judicial system, our legal system, our sporting system, our religious system is based on dominance, fighting. You are above or you're above. You win this game, you win this case. It's confrontational. I think something that many Westerners think is just a cover but I think is really sincere in China, is that it's not based on a confrontational model. Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism are not. Taoism is a peaceful religion on the whole, as is Confucianism, non-religion, philosophy. It's about harmony. China is about harmony. I think if you had a frank conversation between Xi Jinping and Biden, and they sat quietly together and they said, what would you like? I think the Chinese would say, what we would like is to be respected and to work with you on world problems and to pool our resources and to act harmoniously as brothers or people should do. We're not in a game of defeating you. What's the point? You can have a good life, we can have a good life. And they might even cite Adam Smith, because Adam Smith pointed out that international economics is not based on a zero-sum games. It's based on mutual benefit. But trade is not about winners and losers. The philosophy of a real estate mogul in America, of whom we had some experience recently, that if they win, you lose. If they do well, you lose. The idea that if China develops really good technologies, we lose something. If they produce goods cheaply, we lose something. That is not what Adam Smith thought. A division of labor, yes, but mutual benefit. And Chinese philosophy and Confucianism and the other philosophies is based on that idea of yin and yang. We depend on each other. We live in too small a world to go on playing those 19th century games of winners and losers. And I think China, if it was allowed to say what it really thought and was respected in what it thought, would say these things. So I think I wouldn't be too worried about it.
Well, on that very encouraging and reassuring note, Alan, we've come to the end of our time. I can't thank you enough for spending time with us this afternoon and for sharing a most engaging and informative and thought-provoking talk with us. Very best of luck on your continued work in China and on your next publication project. And do come visit us again sometime.
Thank you very much, Hank.
Bye-bye now.